Tiny black twins stand before a judge, their voices shaking, their stomachs empty. "We're starving, sir," one of them whispers, her eyes hollow with hunger. The courtroom falls silent, but the moment the judge looks at them, something inside him shatters. Because these girls aren't just another case file. They are the key to a past he buried long ago, and a truth that will change everything. Who are they? What happened to them? And why does the judge instantly burst into tears? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you love emotional, life-changing stories, don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead in courtroom 7B, casting harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches. Judge Walter Grayson sat behind his imposing desk, his black robe settling heavily on his shoulders. He'd heard thousands of cases in this very room, but something felt different today. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Two small figures stood before him, their hands clasped together like lifelines. Mira and Nia Avery, identical twins down to their matching braids, though one wore hers slightly looser than the other. Their clothes hung loose on their thin frames, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and knees. Dark circles shadowed their eyes, making them look older than their 12 years. "We're starving, sir," Mira said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the quiet courtroom. Her words were direct, without self-pity or dramatics, just a simple statement of fact. Walter felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar tightness. He'd built his career on being detached, analytical. Emotions had no place in a court of law. But these girls, there was something about them. Something in Mira's steady gaze that made his carefully constructed walls waver. Helen Carter, their social worker, stepped forward. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from fighting too many losing battles. Her navy blue blazer was slightly wrinkled, and she clutched a thick manila folder like it contained explosives. "Your Honor," Helen began, her voice steady despite the shadows under her eyes, "I have the case file for Mira and Nia Avery." She opened the folder, and Walter noticed her hands trembling slightly. The twins were discovered 3 days ago in the basement of the Callahan residence. They were locked in, Your Honor. The room had no proper ventilation, no bathroom facilities, and no beds. Just 2 thin blankets on a concrete floor. Walter's grip tightened on his pen. He'd known the Callahans socially. They were fixtures at charity galas and community events. Richard Callahan played golf at the same country club as half the judges in the district. Helen continued, each word seeming to cost her something. They were being fed irregularly, mostly scraps and leftover food. Medical examination shows signs of prolonged malnutrition and vitamin deficiency. She paused, swallowing hard. This isn't the first time concerns have been raised about the Callahans. They've fostered 7 other black children over the past decade. All of them reported similar treatment, but somehow, she looked down at her hands. Somehow the complaints never stuck. The twins stood perfectly still throughout Helen's report. No tears, no trembling. Just those steady eyes fixed on Walter, watching, waiting. Mira's grip on her sister's hand never loosened. Walter found himself unable to look away from them. There was something familiar in their expressions, not just the pain, but the dignity with which they bore it. It stirred something in his memory, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Prior to the Callahans, Helen went on, the girls were placed in 5 different homes over 2 years. Each placement ended in, she shuffled through her papers, in unfortunate circumstances. That's how it's recorded in their file. But reading between the lines, Your Honor, these children have never been given a real chance. Walter's hands began to shake as he gripped his gavel. He'd presided over hundreds of custody cases, signed countless orders that sent children to new homes or back to old ones. He'd always trusted the system, believed in its ability to protect the vulnerable. But looking at these girls, really looking at them, he felt that certainty crumbling. That night, sleep eluded him. Walter tossed in his king-sized bed, tangling in Egyptian cotton sheets that suddenly felt suffocating. When dreams finally came, they weren't dreams at all, but memories. Warm hands adjusting his bow tie before Sunday school. the smell of vanilla and coconut oil, a soft voice humming gospel songs while stirring a pot of soup that somehow always seemed to multiply when hungry neighbors stopped by. "You are not alone, baby boy." The voice was clear as day, wrapping around him like a warm blanket. In his dream, he was small again, crying because the other children had made fun of his second-hand clothes. Those gentle hands wiped his tears away, and that voice, firm but so full of love, told him he was worth more than what others saw. Walter sat up with a gasp, his heart pounding. Sweat dampened his silk pajamas as the fragments of memory settled into place. Those hands belonged to Louise Avery, Mama Lou, as everyone in the neighborhood had called her. She'd been his family's housekeeper, but to him she'd been so much more. When his parents were too busy with their social obligations to notice their only son, Mama Lou had been there. She'd fed him, cared for him, loved him when he'd needed it most. He hadn't thought about her in years, had deliberately pushed those memories away as he climbed the social ladder, as he made himself into the kind of man his parents had wanted him to be. But now, looking back at those two girls in his courtroom, he couldn't ignore the connection anymore. Avery. The same last name couldn't be a coincidence. Those eyes that seemed to see right through him. They were Mama Lou's eyes, looking at him from two young faces that carried her strength. The digital clock on his nightstand read 3:47 a.m. when Walter reached for his phone. His fingers moved on autopilot as he dialed his most trusted private investigator. "I need everything you can find on Mira and Nia Avery," he said when a groggy voice answered. "Their family history, their mother, their father, everything. And I need it fast." Hours later, Walter's office was silent except for the soft rustling of papers and his increasingly sharp breaths. The leather chair creaked as he leaned forward, his hands trembling as he turned another page of the private investigator's report. Each new detail felt like a physical blow, making his chest tighter and his stomach churn. The thick manila folder was filled with photographs, police reports, and court documents. They told a story that made Walter's carefully ordered world tilt on its axis. There, in crisp black and white, was Celeste Avery's employee ID photo. She had the same determined set to her jaw that he saw in Mira, the same fierce intelligence in her eyes that Nia possessed. The report detailed how she had filed multiple discrimination complaints against Riverside Medical Center, where she'd worked as a nurse practitioner. 3 formal complaints in 6 months, Walter muttered, running his finger along the typed lines. All properly documented, all ignored. Then, like a story cutting off mid-sentence, Celeste vanished. No body was ever found. No closure was ever given. The police report used phrases like insufficient evidence and case remains open. But Walter had been in the system long enough to recognize the hallmarks of an investigation that was never meant to succeed. He turned to the next section, his mouth going dry as he read about Isaiah Avery. The armed robbery charge seemed to materialize out of thin air. No physical evidence, no reliable witnesses, just circumstantial connections that any first-year law student could have picked apart. But the case had been pushed through with surprising speed by District Attorney Marcus Langley. Walter's hand froze on the page. Marcus Langley. They'd played golf together just last month, laughed over drinks at the country club. Langley had been his colleague for decades, a man Walter had always considered shrewd, but fair. Now looking at Isaiah's case file, Walter saw something else entirely, a systematic dismantling of a man's life, piece by careful piece. But it was the last page that made Walter's world stop spinning entirely. There, in neat typescript, was a family tree. And right there, at the top of one branch, was a name that sent him reeling back in his chair. Louise Avery, he whispered, the name feeling both foreign and achingly familiar on his tongue. Mama Lou? The office seemed to fade away as memories flooded back, memories he'd carefully packed away in the dusty corners of his mind. The smell of vanilla and coconut oil. Warm hands adjusting his school tie. A soft voice singing gospel songs while stirring endless pots of soup that somehow fed anyone who showed up hungry at their door. Louise Avery hadn't just been his family's housekeeper. She'd been his real mother in all the ways that mattered. While his biological parents attended endless social functions and charity galas, Louise had been there for every skinned knee, every nightmare, every triumph and failure. Walter closed his eyes, remembering how she'd taught him to read, sitting patiently with him at the kitchen table long after her workday should have ended. How she'd slipped extra sandwiches into his lunchbox when his parents were too busy with their social climbing to notice he was growing like a weed and always hungry. How she'd held him when he cried after the other children mocked his awkwardness, telling him he was worth more than their cruel words. The memories kept coming, relentless now. Louise, always in her neat uniform, cooking elaborate meals for his parents' dinner parties, but eating her own lunch in the kitchen. Louise calling him baby boy when they were alone, but Master Walter when others were present. Louise teaching him about kindness and justice while living in a world that showed her neither. And what had he done with those lessons? As soon as he'd started climbing the social ladder himself, he'd pushed her away, started calling her Mrs. Avery instead of Mama Lou, stopped visiting the kitchen for their private talks. When she retired, he'd sent a card and a check, a cold gesture that must have broken her heart. Walter opened his eyes, looking down at the twins' case file spread across his desk. The system he'd spent his career upholding, the one he'd convinced himself was fair and just, had failed Louise's family at every turn. Her daughter had vanished without a trace. Her son-in-law had been imprisoned on trumped-up charges. And now her granddaughters stood in his courtroom, starving and abandoned. The guilt hit him like a physical wave. He'd built his entire career on looking the other way, on believing that justice was blind when he knew, had always known, that it wasn't. Louise had taught him to see the truth, to stand up for what was right, and he'd deliberately forgotten those lessons in his pursuit of power and position. His hands shook as he gathered the papers, stacking them neatly in the folder. Mira and Nia's faces stared up at him from their case file photos, two young girls who carried Louise's strength in their eyes, who stood before him with the same dignity she had always shown in the face of injustice. They were starving. The thought echoed in his mind, becoming more unbearable with each repetition. Louise's granddaughters were starving in a system he helped maintain, the same system that had swallowed their mother whole and locked their father away, the same system that had allowed him to forget the woman who had given him everything. Walter's vision blurred as he looked at the twins' file again. The stark fact seemed to leap off the page. 5 foster homes in 2 years, each placement worse than the last. Reports of abuse ignored, complaints dismissed. All while he sat in his comfortable chambers, believing in a justice system that had failed them at every turn. The next day, the morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Walter adjusted his robes, his heart hammering against his ribs as he prepared to enter the packed courtroom. He'd called this emergency hearing with barely 24 hours' notice, and word had spread quickly. The hallways buzzed with speculation. Inside courtroom 3A, every bench was filled. Social workers, court officers, local media, and curious onlookers crowded the space. In the front row, Ms. Helen Carter sat with Mira and Nia, who looked even smaller in the morning light. They wore clean but ill-fitting clothes from the emergency shelter, their shoulders pressed together as if bracing for another disappointment. Walter took his seat at the bench, his fingers brushing against the folder hidden beneath his robes, the one containing all the evidence of his own failures and the system's corruption. The bailiff called the court to order, and a heavy silence fell over the room. "This emergency hearing concerns the placement of Mira and Nia Avery," Walter began, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "After careful review of their case, I have come to a decision that diverges from standard protocol." He paused, looking directly at the twins. Mira's face remained carefully blank, but Nia's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to read his intentions. "I am filing a petition to legally adopt Mira and Nia Avery myself." The words hung in the air for one breathless moment. Then chaos erupted. Gasps and exclamations filled the courtroom. Ms. Carter's mouth fell open in shock. Several attorneys jumped to their feet, objections already forming on their lips. The twins themselves sat frozen, their expressions a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "Order!" Walter's gavel cracked against the sound block. "I will have order in this court." The room gradually quieted, but the tension remained electric. Walter could see his colleague Judge Martinez shaking his head in disapproval from the gallery. District Attorney Langley, who had slipped in just before the announcement, wore an expression of calculated concern. "Your Honor," Langley stood, his voice smooth as oil. "While your humanitarian gesture is admirable, surely you recognize the impropriety of this situation. There are numerous qualified families waiting to adopt." "Like the Callahans?" Walter cut in, his voice sharp. "Yes, I've reviewed their file as well, along with several other qualified families who have systematically abused and neglected these children." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The Callahans, sitting near the back, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was swift and fierce. News vans gathered like vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Social media exploded with opinions. Within hours, a group of white parents had organized a protest on the courthouse steps, holding signs that read, "Stop the virtue signaling," and "Children aren't political props." The black community's response was equally skeptical, though for different reasons. Reverend James Marshall, a prominent civil rights leader, gave a press conference expressing concern about a white judge's ability to raise black children in a culturally sensitive way. "We've seen too many white savior narratives," he declared. "These girls need connection to their community and heritage." Inside his chambers, Walter's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Colleagues, friends, even his country club associates called to express their concern. Judge Martinez visited personally, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "You'll lose everything, Walter," Martinez said, his face grave. "Your position, your reputation, your social standing, all of it. Is that what you want?" Walter looked at the photo on his desk, himself at his swearing-in ceremony, young and proud, believing he was serving justice. How blind he'd been. "Maybe I need to lose it," he replied quietly. The most difficult conversation came that afternoon. Ms. Carter brought the twins to his chambers, as required by the emergency custody proceedings. Mira stood slightly in front of her sister, protective as always. Nia, usually the more outspoken one, watched him with cold eyes. "Why now?" Nia finally asked, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. "You didn't care before. All those times we were in your courtroom, all those horrible homes you sent us to, you didn't care then." Walter felt the truth of her words like a physical pain. He opened his mouth to explain about Louise, about his guilt, about his desperate need to make things right. But the words wouldn't come. How could he explain something he was still struggling to understand himself? "You're right," he said instead. "I didn't care enough before. I was wrong." "That's not an answer," Mira said quietly. "No, it's not," Walter agreed. "And you deserve better than that. Both of you do." Despite the protests, despite the whispered threats and the petition being passed around to have him removed from the bench, Walter pressed forward with the emergency custody hearing. He presented evidence of the systemic failures in the twins' previous placements. He underwent rushed home studies and background checks. He hired experts to testify about the trauma the girls had endured and their need for immediate stable placement. 3 days later, in a different courtroom with a different judge, Walter won emergency custody. The ruling came down late in the afternoon, when most of the protesters had gone home. The twins gathered their few belongings. Everything they owned fit into 2 small backpacks, while Walter signed the temporary custody papers. There was no celebration, no happy hugs or tears of joy like in the movies. Mira and Nia simply stood beside him in the empty courtroom, their faces unreadable. Walter felt the weight of their scrutiny, understanding that while he had won the legal right to care for them, he had not yet earned their trust. As they walked out of the courtroom together, their footsteps echoing in the marble hallway, Walter realized this wasn't an ending at all. It was barely even a beginning. Later, Walter's house stood like a museum piece in one of Baltimore's most exclusive neighborhoods, all clean lines, modern furniture, and pristine white walls. As he led Mira and Nia through the front door, their worn backpacks and shabby clothes seemed out of place against the sterile perfection of his home. "This will be your home now," Walter said, his voice echoing in the vast foyer. The words felt strange in his mouth. For 20 years, he'd lived here alone, and the house had never felt like a home, even to him. The twins said nothing, their eyes taking in the expensive artwork and designer furniture. Nia's hand tightened around Mira's, and Walter noticed how they stayed close together, as if expecting to be separated at any moment. "Let me show you to your room," he offered, leading them up the curved staircase. Their footsteps were nearly silent on the plush carpet, like they were trying to leave no trace of their presence. The guest bedroom, their room now, Walter reminded himself, was as impersonal as the rest of the house. King-sized bed with crisp white linens, abstract paintings on the walls, heavy curtains drawn against the evening light. Nothing about it suggested children had ever lived here before. "You can make it your own," Walter said awkwardly, realizing how empty the words sounded. The twins placed their backpacks carefully by the bed, not unpacking. Dinner was worse. Walter's housekeeper had prepared a meal before leaving for the day, some elaborate French dish he couldn't pronounce. The three of them sat at opposite ends of the long dining table, the silence broken only by the quiet clink of silverware against expensive china. Mira and Nia barely touched their food, pushing it around their plates with careful, measured movements. Walter watched them, trying to remember what children like to eat. He'd never had to think about it before. "Is the food not good?" he asked, cringing at how formal he sounded. "It's fine," Mira answered quietly, her eyes fixed on her plate. "We're just not hungry," Nia added, though Walter had heard their stomachs growling earlier. He remembered suddenly how their mother, Celeste, used to make them mac and cheese with hot dogs cut into little octopuses, a detail from their case file. The fancy French cuisine must seem as alien to them as this whole situation. "We could order pizza," he suggested, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Both girls looked up, surprised by the casual offer. "Really?" Nia asked, a tiny crack in her careful facade. "Of course, what kind do you like?" They exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that twins seemed capable of. "Pepperoni," they said together, then quickly looked down again, as if afraid they'd shown too much enthusiasm. Walter ordered the pizza, and when it arrived, they ate in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. The girls still didn't eat much, but they seemed less tense, occasionally stealing glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking. Night fell, and Walter showed them where to find clean towels, toothbrushes, and new pajamas he'd had his assistant buy. Everything felt stiff and awkward, like a badly rehearsed play where nobody knew their lines. "Good night," he said finally, standing in their doorway. "If you need anything." He trailed off, realizing he didn't know how to finish that sentence. The twins nodded politely, already in their new pajamas, sitting side by side on the edge of the bed. In his office, Walter couldn't focus on work. He kept thinking about the girls in that too-big room, wondering if they were afraid, if they felt safe, if they were planning to run away. His eyes drifted to the photograph on his desk, Mama Lou on her last day of work, smiling despite the tears in her eyes. He'd been too busy to attend her retirement party, sending a generic card instead. "What would you do?" he whispered to her image. Louise had always known exactly how to comfort him when he was scared or lonely. She'd sing spirituals while cooking, tell him stories about her childhood in Georgia, hold him close when his parents forgot his birthday again. But Walter had never learned those skills from her. He'd buried that part of himself, along with his memories of her, in his rush to become the person his parents wanted him to be. Now, faced with two traumatized children who needed more than just a roof over their heads, he felt completely lost. The house creaked and settled around him as the night grew deeper. Walter sat in his office, unable to sleep, listening for any sound from upstairs. Around midnight, he heard it, soft whispers floating down the hallway. What if he changes his mind? Mira's voice, barely audible. What if this is just another foster home? Nia replied, fear making her voice crack. Remember what happened with the Callahans? They seemed nice at first, too. At least we're together this time. They can't separate us again, right? Walter's chest tightened at their words. How many times had they been promised safety, only to have it ripped away? How many nice homes had turned cruel once the social workers left? The whispers continued, punctuated by quiet sniffles. Walter stood up several times, wanting to go to them. But what could he say? What right did he have to comfort them when he'd been part of the system that failed them? Then he heard it. Actual crying, muffled but unmistakable. The sound cut through all his hesitation, awakening something he thought he'd lost long ago. Before he could second-guess himself, he was walking down the hallway, stopping outside their door. His hand shook slightly as he knocked 2 gentle taps. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by tense silence. "You're safe here," he said softly through the door, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his life. No response came from the other side, but he could feel them listening. He waited a moment longer, then added, "I promise." Still no answer, but when he listened carefully, he noticed something different. The earlier tension in their silence had eased slightly. They weren't holding their breath anymore, weren't trying to make themselves invisible. It wasn't much. They still didn't trust him, still didn't believe this was real. But for the first time since they'd entered his house, they didn't flinch at the sound of his voice. Walter stood there a moment longer, his hand resting on the door, knowing this tiny shift was just the beginning. The morning sun streamed through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across Walter's immaculate house. Everything was in its proper place, the furniture perfectly arranged, the surfaces spotless, the air itself seeming filtered of any trace of life. But the pristine order felt wrong now, like a museum where children weren't allowed to touch anything. Upstairs, Mira and Nia lay awake in the enormous bed, their small forms almost lost in the sea of expensive linens. They hadn't slept much, despite the softness of the mattress and the warmth of the thick comforter. The comfort felt foreign, dangerous even, a trick they'd fallen for before in other homes that had seemed nice at first. Their backpacks remained by the door where they'd left them the night before, still packed. Unpacking meant believing they would stay, and neither girl was ready for that kind of hope yet. In the kitchen, Walter stood at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes like he'd seen in commercials. He'd watched a cooking video online before dawn, determined to make a proper breakfast. The first few attempts had ended up in the trash, but these looked almost right, golden brown, mostly circular. He heard the twins before he saw them, their quiet footsteps coming down the stairs in perfect sync. They appeared in the doorway, already dressed in their old clothes despite the new ones he'd bought them, their hair neatly braided, clearly having helped each other get ready without asking for assistance. "Good morning," Walter said, trying to sound cheerful but hearing the awkwardness in his own voice. "I made pancakes." The girls sat at the kitchen island, perched on the edge of their stools like birds ready to take flight. Their eyes moved from the plate of pancakes to Walter and back again, but they made no move to eat. "We don't like pancakes," Mira said quietly, her voice flat and careful. Walter's hand froze midair, the spatula dripping batter onto the counter. "Oh," he managed, suddenly aware of how little he knew about them. What did they like? What were they used to eating? The case file had mentioned their mother's cooking, but he'd foolishly thought any breakfast would do. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. The twins watched him with guarded eyes, waiting to see how he would react to their rejection. In their experience, adults didn't like being told no. Throughout the day, Walter tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but everything felt forced and uncomfortable. He showed them around the house again, pointing out rooms they could use: the library, the entertainment room, even his home office if they needed a quiet place to study. But the girls moved through the spaces like ghosts, careful not to touch anything, leaving no trace of their presence. When he suggested they might each like their own bedroom, he had plenty of spare rooms after all, they both stiffened. "We want to stay together," Nia said, gripping her sister's hand tightly. "Please," Mira added, and something in her tone made Walter's chest ache. It wasn't a request, it was a plea. They'd been separated before in other homes, and the fear of it happening again was written clearly on their faces. "Of course," he said quickly, "whatever makes you comfortable." But comfort seemed impossible to find. At lunch, they sat at the kitchen island again, this time facing sandwiches Walter had ordered from a local deli. The girls waited, perfectly still, until Walter picked up his own sandwich first. Only then did they reach for their food, taking small, careful bites as if expecting to be told they were eating too much. Walter remembered similar meals with his own parents, formal affairs where children were seen and not heard, where every bite was monitored, every movement criticized. But this was different. The twins weren't worried about proper etiquette. They were waiting for punishment for the other shoe to drop. Their backpacks remained packed, appearing in whatever room they occupied like silent reminders that they didn't believe this arrangement would last. When Walter passed their bedroom that evening, he saw them carefully folding their few clothes, keeping everything ready for a quick departure. After another quiet dinner, Walter retreated to his office, leaving the door slightly ajar as he had since they arrived. He could hear them moving around upstairs, their footsteps lighter now that they thought he wasn't paying attention. Then, as the house grew darker and quieter, their whispers drifted down the hallway. "How long do you think before he gives up on us too?" Naya's voice was small but clear. "I don't know," Mira replied. "The Callahans lasted 2 weeks before they said we were too difficult. And the Petersons only kept us 4 days. At least he let us stay together for now." The words hit Walter like physical blows. He sat at his desk, overwhelmed by guilt and inadequacy. These children had been failed so many times, by so many people, including him, in his role as a judge who had approved countless placements without looking deeper into the system's flaws. His eyes drifted to the photograph on his desk, Mama Lou on her last day of work. Her smile was warm even in the faded picture, her eyes full of the love and patience he'd never appreciated enough. She had made him feel safe when his own parents couldn't, had given him a sense of home he'd spent decades trying to forget. Walter picked up the photograph, studying Louise's face as if it might hold answers. She would have known what to do. She would have known how to reach these girls, how to show them they were wanted, how to make this house feel like a home. For the first time since taking in the twins, Walter allowed himself to wonder if he was capable of doing the same. Could he, who had spent so long building walls around himself, learn to create the kind of safety Mama Lou had once given him? The question settled heavily in his chest, accompanied by the continued whispers of 2 scared children who expected nothing from him but eventual abandonment. Days later, the morning was crisp and clear as Walter's car pulled up to the Callahan residence. The mansion loomed before him, its pristine white columns and perfectly manicured lawn presenting an image of suburban perfection. But something about the property felt wrong. Too perfect, too staged, like a movie set waiting for actors to bring it to life. Walter straightened his tie, more out of habit than necessity. He wasn't here as a judge today, but old habits died hard. The weight of his badge felt heavy in his pocket as he approached the front door, its brass knocker gleaming in the morning sun. Mrs. Callahan answered on the 3rd knock. She was exactly as described in the case files, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, expensive clothing, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Judge Grayson," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure." "Mrs. Callahan," Walter replied formally, "I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I'd like to discuss Mira and Nia Avery." Something flickered across her face, so brief Walter might have missed it if he hadn't spent decades reading people in his courtroom. Fear? Anger? But her smile never wavered as she stepped aside. "Of course, please come in." The interior of the house was even more pristine than the exterior. The foyer gleamed with polished marble, and expensive artwork adorned the walls. But what struck Walter most was the silence. No TV sounds, no music, no signs of life, just the click of Mrs. Callahan's heels on the floor and the distant hum of air conditioning. Mr. Callahan appeared from what appeared to be his study, his business casual attire suggesting he worked from home. His handshake was firm, practiced, like everything else about him. "Judge Grayson, what brings you to our humble home?" Walter noticed how they positioned themselves, one on either side of him, subtly blocking his view of the hallway behind them. "I'm here about the twins," he said directly. "I'd like to understand their time here." "We treated those girls well, Judge," Mrs. Callahan said quickly, too quickly. We gave them everything they needed. New clothes, good food, their own rooms. The best education money could buy, Mr. Callahan added, his tone suggesting they should be grateful for his generosity. But Walter had seen Mira and Nia's condition when they first appeared in his courtroom. Their clothes had been old and worn, their bodies thin from malnutrition. He'd reviewed their school records. They hadn't attended classes for weeks before being found. May I see their rooms? Walter asked, keeping his voice neutral despite the anger building in his chest. The Callahans exchanged a quick glance. We've redecorated since they left, Mrs. Callahan said smoothly. Turned them into guest rooms. We're always ready for the next child in need, you understand? The rehearsed quality of their responses made Walter's skin crawl. Everything about this place felt wrong. The silence, the perfectionism, the careful way they monitored his movements. He made a show of checking his watch. Thank you for your time, I have another appointment to keep. They seemed relieved to show him out, their smiles more genuine now that he was leaving. As he walked back to his car, Walter's trained eye caught sight of something. Security cameras mounted discreetly around the porch. High-end models, the kind that recorded everything. His next stop was across town, in a modest office building that housed various social services departments. Ms. Lopez, the twins' previous caseworker, was waiting for him in a small conference room. She was younger than he expected, with nervous hands that couldn't seem to stay still. Thank you for meeting with me, Walter said, sitting across from her. I need to understand what happened with the Callahans. Ms. Lopez glanced at the door as if checking that it was closed. The Callahans, she began, then stopped, choosing her words carefully. They have a history of taking in black foster children, but only as long as the checks keep coming. Walter leaned forward. What do you mean? They're selective about which children they foster. Always black children from difficult backgrounds. Children less likely to be believed if they complain. She twisted her hands together. The payments are generous for foster parents with their qualifications. But once the children start asking questions or demanding basic rights, the children get labeled as difficult and sent back, Walter finished, remembering similar patterns from countless cases he'd presided over. Ms. Lopez nodded. The twins weren't the first ones to leave their care malnourished, but the Callahans have money, connections. They donate to all the right charities, host fundraisers for children's causes. Nobody wants to question them too closely. Walter thought of the silent house, the blocked hallways, the careful monitoring of his movements. What happened to Mira and Nia there? Ms. Lopez's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Mira and Nia told me they were locked in a basement when they acted out. Her fingers made air quotes around the words. I reported it, but nothing happened. The investigation was closed before it began. Walter's fists clenched under the table. How many cases like this had crossed his desk? How many times had he accepted surface-level investigations, trusted the system to protect these children? The weight of his own complicity pressed down on him like a physical force. The basement, he said, his voice rough. Did anyone verify their story? The Callahans claimed it was just a timeout room, perfectly legal, properly furnished. Ms. Lopez's bitter laugh held no humor. But when I visited, they wouldn't let me see it, said it was being renovated. Walter remembered the security cameras at the Callahans' house, silent witnesses to everything that happened there. If those cameras had been running during the twins' stay, his mind raced with possibilities, but he kept his expression neutral. Thank you for your honesty, he said, standing. You've been very helpful. As he left the building, Walter couldn't shake the image of those cameras. Modern security systems kept their footage for months. Everything that happened at the Callahan house, every child who entered and left, every time that basement door opened and closed, would be recorded somewhere. The cameras watched him as he got into his car, their lenses glinting in the afternoon sun. Behind their perfect facade, the Callahans' house held secrets, and those cameras might just be the key to exposing them all. That night, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the central air when Walter jerked awake in his bed. Something had disturbed his sleep, a sound that didn't belong in his usually silent home. He lay still, listening intently, and there it was again. A muffled whimper echoing down the hallway. His heart rate quickened as he slipped out of bed, his bare feet silent against the hardwood floors. The sound grew clearer as he approached the twins' room. The door was slightly ajar, casting a thin slice of hallway light across the carpet. Inside, Mira was curled into a tight ball on the bed, her face contorted in distress. Small sounds of fear escaped her lips as she clutched Nia's hand with white-knuckled intensity. Nia lay beside her sister, wide awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if counting invisible stars. Walter hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. His presence might only make things worse. He was still a stranger to them, after all. But before he could decide, Nia's voice broke the silence. "She has nightmares," Nia said softly, not taking her eyes off the ceiling. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet house it carried clearly. Walter eased himself down to sit at the edge of the doorway, careful to maintain what he hoped was a non-threatening distance. "About what?" he asked, matching her quiet tone. "The basement." Those two words hit Walter like a physical blow. His chest tightened as he remembered Ms. Lopez's words about the Callahan's basement, about the investigations that went nowhere. He watched as Nia's free hand absently traced patterns on the blanket, her other hand still firmly gripped by her sleeping sister. Mira whimpered again, her face scrunching up as if trying to escape something only she could see. Nia squeezed her sister's hand tighter, and gradually, Mira's features relaxed slightly. Walter sat there for a long time, a silent guardian in the doorway, watching as Mira's troubled sleep eventually smoothed into something more peaceful. He stayed until Nia's eyes finally fluttered closed, her hand still linked with her sister's. The next morning, Walter was already in the kitchen when the twins came down for breakfast. He'd barely slept after returning to his room, his mind too full of dark basements and frightened children. He'd made eggs and toast, simple food he couldn't mess up, and had a fresh pot of coffee brewing. The girls entered cautiously as they did every morning, scanning the room before settling into their chairs. Walter noticed how they always sat close together, shoulders almost touching, as if drawing strength from each other's presence. He placed plates in front of them, then poured himself another cup of coffee. The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows seemed at odds with the heavy atmosphere. "Would you like to talk about last night?" he asked carefully, watching their reactions over the rim of his coffee mug. "About the nightmares?" Mira's face immediately closed off, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. She gave a sharp shake of her head and focused intently on her eggs, her shoulders tensing visibly. But Nia, after a long moment of silence, set down her toast. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "They locked us in there for days," she said, her voice small but steady. Walter's grip on his coffee mug tightened. He forced himself to remain still, to keep his face neutral despite the rage building inside him. He didn't want to frighten them with his anger, even though it wasn't directed at them. "They turned off the lights," Nia continued, the words coming faster now, as if she needed to get them out before her courage failed. Her eyes remained fixed on her hands. "It was so dark we couldn't see anything. We couldn't tell if it was day or night." Mira had stopped eating entirely, her food forgotten as she stared at her plate. Her silence spoke volumes about the trauma they'd endured. "We had to drink from a bucket." Nia's voice cracked slightly on the last word. She finally looked up at Walter, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "They said we were animals, so we should drink like animals." The coffee mug in Walter's hand creaked dangerously as his grip tightened further. He carefully set it down before he shattered it, his knuckles white with suppressed fury. This wasn't just neglect or casual cruelty. This was calculated abuse. The Callahans had systematically dehumanized these children, treated them worse than animals, and the system, his system, had allowed it to happen. He looked at the two girls sitting at his table, Mira rigid with tension, Nia trying so hard to be brave, and felt something shift inside him. These children had been failed by everyone who should have protected them. Their parents had vanished or been imprisoned, their grandmother was gone, and the foster care system had thrown them to the wolves. Walter's jaw clenched as he made a private vow. He would never let anyone hurt them again. And the Callahans? They would pay for what they had done. He would make sure of it. Days later, the morning sun cast long shadows across Walter's office as he waited for James O'Connor. The retired detective had been recommended by a trusted colleague, someone who knew how to dig deep without drawing attention. Walter had given him a simple task: investigate the Callahans and their connection to the foster care system. A knock at the door pulled Walter from his thoughts. James O'Connor entered, looking exactly as Walter had expected. Weathered face, sharp eyes, and the careful movements of someone who had spent decades watching his back. Under his arm, he carried a thick manila envelope. "Judge Grayson," O'Connor said, settling into the chair across from Walter's desk. His voice was gruff, matching his appearance. "I've got what you asked for." He placed the envelope on the desk but kept his hand on it. "But before I show you this, I need to know, are you sure you want to see it?" Walter's eyebrows rose slightly. "That bad?" O'Connor's face hardened. "I don't know what you expected to find, but it's worse than you think." He pushed the envelope across the desk. "Much worse." Walter opened the envelope with steady hands, though his heart was racing. The first document was a spreadsheet, names, dates, and case numbers spanning a decade. All black children, all placed with the Callahans, all removed within months. 13 kids, O'Connor said quietly. That's just in the last 10 years. Notice anything strange about the removal dates? Walter studied the pattern. Each child had been removed just before scheduled home visits or medical checkups. The official reasons varied: placement unsuccessful, child behavioral issues, family circumstances changed, but the timing was too consistent to be coincidental. The next set of documents made his stomach turn: complaint forms, incident reports, medical records, all showing clear signs of abuse and neglect. But each investigation had been closed before it could begin. The paperwork was perfect, the signatures all in order, but nothing ever came of them. "Keep going," O'Connor urged. "Look at who signed off on closing these cases." Walter flipped through the pages, his legal training allowing him to quickly spot the key details. The same names kept appearing: judges he knew, social workers he'd seen in his courtroom, and most frequently, District Attorney Marcus Langley's signature, authorizing the closure of each investigation. "Langley?" Walter muttered, more to himself than O'Connor. "He's been involved in all of these?" O'Connor leaned forward. "That's not all. Check the financial records." The next section revealed a complex web of transactions: government foster care payments, charitable donations, tax write-offs, all flowing through the Callahans' accounts and into various shell companies. Companies that, when traced back, had connections to prominent figures in the justice system. "They're using these kids to launder money," Walter said, his voice tight with anger. "The longer they keep them, the more money they can move." "And the more likely someone might notice," O'Connor added. "That's why they get rid of them quickly, replace them with new ones before anyone starts asking questions." Walter's hands were shaking slightly as he reached the final section of the report. His eyes caught a familiar name: Celeste Avery, the twins' mother. The document was dated just 3 weeks before her disappearance. It was a detailed complaint filed against the Callahans, but it wasn't about foster care. Celeste had been working as a paralegal in a law firm that handled some of the Callahans' business affairs. She had noticed discrepancies in their charitable foundation's records. She was going to expose them, Walter said, his voice barely above a whisper. O'Connor nodded grimly. She had proof: bank records, emails, internal memos, everything needed to bring down not just the Callahans, but everyone involved in their scheme. Walter's blood ran cold as he read the last page. A police report filed the day Celeste disappeared. Her car had been found abandoned on a quiet road. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no body ever found. "And guess who was in charge of the investigation?" O'Connor asked, though Walter already knew the answer. "Marcus Langley," Walter said, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. "Closed the case in record time, ruled it a probable suicide." O'Connor's disgust was evident in his tone. A single mother with 2 young daughters, a good job, and evidence of major criminal activity just happens to vanish without a trace, and nobody asks any questions. Walter stared at the documents spread across his desk, each piece fitting together to form a horrifying picture. This wasn't just about the abuse of foster children, as terrible as that was. This was systematic corruption, a machine built to exploit the most vulnerable while enriching those meant to protect them. And Celeste Avery had discovered it all. She had tried to stop it to protect not just her own children, but all the others who had suffered. And someone with power and influence, had made sure she was silenced. Walter looked up at O'Connor, his face set with determination. "How many copies of this evidence exist?" "3, O'Connor replied. "One's in a safety deposit box, one's with someone I trust, and this one's yours." He paused, studying Walter's face. "What are you going to do with it?" Walter gathered the documents carefully, his mind already racing with possibilities and dangers. Celeste Avery had tried to fight this alone and paid the ultimate price. He wouldn't make the same mistake. That evening, Walter sat in his dimly lit office, the golden rays of sunset casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. The file on Celeste Avery lay open before him, its contents spread out like pieces of a tragic puzzle. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the police reports, witness statements, and financial records that painted a disturbing picture of her final days. The photograph clipped to her file showed a young woman with bright, determined eyes and a warm smile, the same smile he now saw in Mira's face. Celeste hadn't just been a mother fighting for her children. She had been a whistleblower on the verge of exposing something massive, and that discovery had cost her everything. Walter reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over James O'Connor's number for a moment before pressing dial. The retired detective answered on the third ring. "O'Connor," the gruff voice came through. "James, it's Walter Grayson. I need more information on the Callahans, everything you can find. Business dealings, personal connections, property holdings, leave no stone unturned." There was a long pause on the other end. When James spoke again, his voice was lower, more cautious. "Walter, you're messing with people who don't like being investigated. These aren't just rich folks with dirty secrets, they're connected, powerful." "I don't care anymore," Walter replied, his voice firm. "Celeste Avery found something and they killed her for it. Her daughters are sleeping down the hall from my bedroom right now, James. I owe them the truth." Another pause. "Give me 48 hours. True to his word, James arrived at Walter's office 2 days later, carrying a heavy briefcase. The detective's face was drawn, his eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. He locked the door behind him before setting the briefcase on Walter's desk. "What you're about to see," James said, his voice barely above a whisper, "goes way beyond the Callahans. This is systematic, organized." He opened the briefcase and began laying out documents, bank statements, adoption records, internal emails printed on law firm letterhead. Each piece added another layer to a pattern that made Walter's stomach churn. The Callahans weren't just one corrupt foster home. They were part of a network, dozens of homes across the state, all following the same playbook. They specifically targeted Black children, especially those without strong family connections. The government payments for these children were funneled through a maze of shell companies and charitable foundations. "Look at this," James said, pointing to a spreadsheet. "Every time a child is placed, money moves through these accounts. The longer they keep the kids, the more they can launder. But keep them too long." "And someone might notice the abuse," Walter finished, his voice tight with anger. James nodded grimly. "That's where Langley comes in." He pulled out another set of documents, internal memos from the district attorney's office. Every complaint, every investigation, every potential exposure, Langley buried it all. He made sure no one looked too closely. Walter studied the memos, recognizing Langley's signature at the bottom of each one. Marcus Langley, the man he'd worked alongside for years, shared drinks with, trusted as a colleague. All while Langley was protecting this horrific system. Celeste figured it out, James continued, pulling out more papers. Working at that law firm, she had access to the Callahans' records. She started collecting evidence, building a case. "Look at the dates on these documents she copied." She was methodical, careful. Walter's hand shook as he read through Celeste's notes. She had documented everything: the money trail, the pattern of abuse, the connection to Langley's office. She had even identified other families like the Callahans, all part of the same network. 3 days after she made these copies, James said softly, she disappeared. Walter sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The system wasn't just broken. It was deliberately designed to exploit and discard black children, to use them as pawns in a money laundering scheme that enriched everyone involved. Celeste had started pulling at those threads, threatening to unravel the whole operation. And now Walter was holding the very evidence she had died trying to expose. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He might be the only person left who could stop this. With his position as a judge, his access to the system, and now this evidence, he could finish what Celeste started. But as he looked at the documents spread across his desk, another thought chilled him to his core. If Langley discovered what he knew, what he was investigating, he could end up just like Celeste. Another tragic disappearance, another case quickly closed, another truth buried in bureaucratic paperwork. Walter glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Mira and Nia at breakfast that morning, the first time he'd seen them, almost smile. He thought of Celeste's bright eyes in her photograph, the same determination he now felt burning in his chest. "What's our next move?" James asked, breaking the heavy silence. Walter gathered the documents carefully, his jaw set with resolve. "We build the case. Quietly. We find others who might talk. Former foster parents, social workers, anyone who saw something but was too afraid to speak up. And Langley. For now, we stay off his radar, but when we move..." Walter's voice hardened. "We make sure the evidence is too strong, too public for him to bury." James nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what they were undertaking. As he packed up the remaining documents, he paused. "You know what you're risking, right? Your career, your reputation." "My life," Walter finished. "I know." The setting sun cast the office in deep shadows as James left, leaving Walter alone with the evidence of a corruption so vast it made his head spin. Somewhere in the house, he could hear Mira and Nia's quiet voices, probably doing their homework or reading. Two innocent children who had already lost so much to this system. He opened his desk drawer and carefully placed Celeste's file inside, locking it securely. Her daughters deserved to know the truth about their mother, that she wasn't just another missing person, another sad statistic. She was a hero who had died trying to protect children like them. And now Walter had to decide if he was brave enough to follow in her footsteps, knowing exactly what that choice might cost him. Later, Walter stood at his office window, watching Mira and Nia in the backyard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn, highlighting the girls as they sat beneath the old oak tree. They were whispering to each other, heads bent close together, maintaining the careful distance they'd kept since arriving. He noticed how they positioned themselves, always within sight of an exit, always together, always aware of their surroundings. Even in moments of relative peace like this, they carried themselves with a wariness that made his heart ache. Every attempt he'd made to bridge the gap between them had been met with the same cautious resistance. This morning, he tried to engage them over breakfast, asking about their favorite subjects in school. Mira had given single-word answers while Nia had simply pushed her cereal around in the bowl. At lunch, he'd suggested they might want to pick out some new clothes over the weekend. They'd exchanged quick glances before Mira had said, "These are fine," gesturing to their worn hand-me-downs. Walter pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. He'd never felt so helpless in his own home. In the courtroom, he always knew exactly what to say, how to maintain control. But here, watching these two girls who carried the weight of too many broken promises, he felt completely out of his depth. Outside, Nia picked at the grass while Mira kept scanning the yard, her eyes eventually landing on his window. Walter stepped back, not wanting them to feel watched, but he caught the flash of uncertainty that crossed her face. It was the same look she'd given him in the courtroom that first day, a mixture of hope and fear that made him question every decision he'd ever made from the bench. He returned to his desk, trying to focus on the stack of case files that needed his attention. but his mind kept drifting to the conversation he'd overheard the night before. Nia asking Mira if they should unpack their backpacks, Mira insisting they needed to stay ready. The thought of them living in constant preparation for another displacement made his chest tight. The sun had nearly set when he heard it, a soft knock on his office door. It was so quiet he almost thought he'd imagined it, but then it came again, slightly more confident. "Come in," he called out, keeping his voice gentle. The door opened slowly, and Mira stood in the doorway. She was still wearing the oversized sweater she'd arrived in, despite the warm weather. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, but her chin was raised, showing the same quiet determination he'd seen in her mother's photograph. "Can I—" she started, then seemed to gather her courage. "Can I ask you something?" Walter set down his pen carefully, giving her his full attention. "Of course. You can ask me anything." Mira took a small step into the office but remained close to the door. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the law books, the certificates on the walls, the photo of Mama Lou he'd placed on his desk just yesterday. "Why are you doing this?" The question came out in a rush, like she'd been holding it in for days. Walter felt the weight of her gaze. For the first time in his career, he didn't have a prepared answer. No legal precedent to cite, no carefully worded explanation. Just the truth that had been haunting him since he'd first seen them in his courtroom. "Because I should have done something a long time ago," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. Mira's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with an intensity that reminded him so much of Celeste. He could almost see her weighing his words, searching for any hint of deception. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. It wasn't acceptance, not quite. But something in her posture shifted, like a tiny piece of armor being set aside. "Nia wants to know if we can have pizza for dinner," she said, her voice still careful but not quite as guarded as before. Walter felt a smile tugging at his lips. "Pizza sounds perfect. What kind do you like?" "Pepperoni," she answered, then added quickly, "But anything is fine." "Pepperoni it is," he said firmly, wanting her to know her preference mattered. Mira lingered for a moment longer, her hand on the doorframe. She seemed to be considering something else, but then simply nodded again and slipped out of the office. Walter sat back in his chair, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't much, this tiny crack in the walls they'd built around themselves. But it was something. A start. The evening passed quietly. They ate pizza at the kitchen table, and while the twins still didn't say much, the silence felt less heavy than before. Walter noticed Nia actually finished her entire slice, while Mira allowed herself to take seconds without waiting for permission. Later, as Walter prepared for bed, he heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside his door. They paused, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then Nia's voice, small but clear, "Good night, Walter." His throat tightened unexpectedly. It was the first time either of them had called him by name, instead of sir, or just avoiding addressing him altogether. Before he could respond, the footsteps continued down the hall, followed by the quiet click of their bedroom door. Walter sat on the edge of his bed, overwhelmed by the simple power of hearing his name spoken with something other than fear or distrust. It wasn't trust, not yet, but like Mira's nod in his office, like their shared meal at the kitchen table, it was a beginning. Walter's headlights cut through the early evening darkness as he turned onto his street. The day had been long, filled with court proceedings and mounting concerns about the evidence he and James had uncovered. As he approached his house, something caught his eye. A black sedan parked about 50 yards down the street. In the fading light, he could barely make out its shape, but something about it set off warning bells in his mind. No one in the neighborhood owned a car like that. He pulled into his driveway slowly, studying the vehicle in his rearview mirror. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, and there was no movement from within. Walter sat in his car for a moment, debating whether to call the police. But what would he say? That a car he didn't recognize was legally parked on a public street? Finally, he grabbed his briefcase and stepped out. The evening air felt unusually still, and his footsteps seemed too loud on the concrete path to his front door. He could feel eyes on him, though when he glanced back at the sedan, nothing had changed. Inside, Walter locked the door behind him and did a quick check of the house. Mira and Naya were at their after-school program until 6, and the house felt eerily quiet. Everything was exactly as he'd left it that morning, but something felt off, like the air itself had shifted. He had just set his briefcase down when his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen showed an unknown number. Walter hesitated, then answered. "Hello, Judge Grayson." The voice was male, soft but clear, with an edge that made Walter's skin crawl. "You don't know what you're playing with." Walter's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" The line went dead. Walter stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. The threat had been clear, even if the words themselves had seemed almost casual. He quickly checked the number, but it was blocked. His hands shook slightly as he set the phone down on his desk. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tension. When Mira and Nia came home, Walter tried to act normal, but he caught himself checking the windows more often than usual, always half expecting to see that black car still waiting in the darkness. After the girls went to bed, Walter sat in his office, unable to focus on work. The threatening call kept playing in his mind. He was considering calling James to discuss it when his phone rang, making him jump. It was James. "Walter, listen to me." James's voice was urgent, almost panicked, nothing like his usual calm demeanor. "The Callahans aren't just some rich couple abusing the system. They're part of a cover-up, and Langley is at the center of it." Walter leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean?" "I've been digging deeper into Celeste Avery's disappearance," James continued, speaking quickly. "She had proof, Walter. Real proof. Documents showing how Langley and the Callahans were working together, placing black children into abusive homes while stealing money from the foster system. It was all there. Bank records, correspondence, everything." "Where are these documents now?" Walter asked, already reaching for a pen. "That's just it. They vanished when Celeste did. She tried to expose the whole operation and then—" James paused, his breathing heavy. "She went missing the next day. Walter, this goes deep. The Callahans are just the tip of the iceberg. Langley's been running this scheme for years, using his position to cover everything up." Walter thought about the threatening call from earlier. "James, someone called me today. A warning. They know you're looking into it." James's voice dropped lower. "You need to drop this, Walter. If they think you know too much—" A sudden crash echoed through the phone, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Walter shot to his feet. "James? James?" He heard a sharp intake of breath, then what sounded like footsteps. "Oh God," James gasped. Then nothing. The line went dead. Walter's hands were shaking as he immediately tried calling back. The phone rang and rang, eventually going to voicemail. He tried again. And again. No answer. Moving to the window, Walter peered out into the darkness. The street was empty now. The black car was gone, but its absence felt more threatening than its presence had been. Someone was watching him, tracking his movements, monitoring his calls, and now they knew he was getting close to the truth. Walter stood at the window for a long time, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place. Celeste's disappearance, the systematic abuse of black children in foster care, the money laundering, Langley's involvement. It was all connected, and somehow the Callahans were at the center of it. And now James wasn't answering his phone. Walter thought about the twins sleeping upstairs, about their mother who had tried to expose this corruption and paid the ultimate price. He thought about all the other children who had suffered in silence, their abuse hidden behind wealth and influence. The threatening call played again in his mind. You don't know what you're playing with. But he did know. He was playing with power. The kind of power that could make people disappear, the kind that had kept this corrupt system running for years. And now that same power had turned its attention to him. That night, the acrid smell of smoke jolted Walter from his sleep. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment, He lay frozen in bed, wondering if he was dreaming. But the burning scent grew stronger, and an orange glow flickered through his bedroom window. Walter threw off his covers and rushed to the window. His heart stopped. Flames danced at the edge of his perfectly manicured lawn, licking hungrily at the side of his garage. The fire wasn't large yet, but in the darkness it cast menacing shadows across the property. A crash and the sound of breaking glass from downstairs spurred him into action. He bolted from his room, nearly colliding with Mira and Nia in the hallway. The twins were coughing, their eyes wide with terror. "Walter," Nia choked out, clutching her sister's hand, "there's smoke everywhere." He could see the fear in their faces, the same fear they'd worn in the Callahans' home. Without hesitation, Walter wrapped his arms around both girls, pulling them close. "Cover your mouths," he commanded, leading them toward the stairs. "Stay low and follow me." They moved quickly through the house, keeping close to the floor where the air was clearer. The smoke wasn't thick yet, but it was getting worse by the second. Walter's eyes stung as he guided the girls to the front door. As they burst outside into the cool night air, Walter's gaze swept the street. That's when he saw it. A figure standing in the shadows across the road watching them. The streetlight caught something reflective in their hand. Maybe a phone, maybe something else. Before Walter could shout or move toward them, a car's engine roared to life. Tires screeched against asphalt as a dark sedan peeled away from the curb, disappearing around the corner. The same car from earlier, the same people who had threatened him. Sirens wailed in the distance as neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Walter held the twins close, feeling their bodies trembling against him. He could see the source of the fire now. The remains of a Molotov cocktail lay shattered against his garage wall, the flames spreading slowly but steadily up the siding. The fire department arrived within minutes, making quick work of the blaze before it could spread to the house. 2 police officers followed, looking bored as they took Walter's statement. He told them everything, about the threatening call, about James's disappearance, about the figure watching them. But he could tell by their expressions that they weren't taking it seriously. "Probably just kids," one officer said, barely looking up from his notepad. "We'll file a report, but without any real evidence." Walter wanted to argue, to make them understand that this wasn't random vandalism. This was a warning. But he knew it would be useless. The system was already working against him. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. As Walter stood in his driveway, surveying the scorched garage wall, he noticed his neighbors hurrying past without making eye contact. Mrs. Peterson, who usually waved cheerfully on her morning walk, crossed to the other side of the street. Mr. Jenkins, who had lived next door for 15 years, quickly pulled his garbage bins inside when he saw Walter looking his way. At the courthouse, the whispers followed him down every hallway. Colleagues who had once greeted him warmly now found reasons to avoid him. He caught fragments of their conversations. Gone too far, should know better, asking for trouble. But the real blow came that evening when he returned home. He found Mira and Nia in their room, their few belongings packed into the same worn backpacks they'd arrived with. They stood side by side, faces set with determination that couldn't quite mask their fear. "We should go," Mira said quietly, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "You don't deserve this. They're coming after you because of us." Walter felt his heart crack. These girls, who had already lost so much, were willing to give up their first chance at stability to protect him. He crossed the room and knelt before them, looking them both in the eyes. "You are not going anywhere," he said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "If they want to come for me, let them. But I am not letting them take you too." Nia's eyes filled with tears. "But what if they hurt you?" "They already hurt our mom," Mira added, her jaw tight. We can't watch that happen again." Walter reached out, gently taking their hands in his. "Listen to me, both of you. What happened to your mother was wrong. What happened to you was wrong. And I've spent too many years looking the other way while people like Langley and the Callahans hurt children who deserved better." He squeezed their hands. "I'm not running, and I'm not letting you run either. We're going to face this together." For a long moment, the twins just stared at him. Then, slowly, something shifted in their expressions. The fear was still there, but now there was something else too. Trust. For the first time since they'd entered his life, they truly believed him. Mira was the first to move, letting her backpack slip from her shoulder to the floor. Nia followed suit, and before Walter knew what was happening, both girls had thrown their arms around him. He held them close, feeling their racing hearts gradually slow to match his own steady rhythm. As he held them, Walter's mind turned to Celeste Avery. She had died trying to expose the truth about this corrupt system. She had tried to protect not just her own children, but all the children who had been victimized by Langley's scheme. Now holding her daughters, Walter knew what he had to do. He had to finish what Celeste started. He had to bring down Marcus Langley. Not just for Mira and Nia, but for every child who had suffered in silence while the system looked the other way. Next day, Walter sat in his office, surrounded by towering stacks of reports and documents. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across his desk. His eyes burned from lack of sleep as he pored over every scrap of information about Celeste Avery's last known movements. James O'Connor's final words echoed in his mind. The veteran investigator had discovered something crucial about Langley's connection to the foster care system. But now James was gone, probably dead. The police showed no interest in investigating his disappearance, treating it as just another missing person case. Walter rubbed his temples, fighting off a headache. Coffee cups littered his desk, evidence of his sleepless nights. He'd been through every document twice, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might lead him to what Celeste had uncovered before she vanished. His eyes fell on a seemingly insignificant detail in one of the reports: Celeste's workplace, an old government records office. It was where she had filed her discrimination complaints against the Callahans. Something about that detail nagged at him. If Celeste had found evidence of corruption, that office would have been the perfect place to look. Walter knew going there was dangerous. Langley's people would be watching his every move. But with James gone and the police turning a blind eye, he was running out of options. He straightened his tie and gathered his courage. Sometimes the most dangerous path was the only one left. The government records office was housed in an aging brick building downtown. Its worn steps and faded signage spoke of decades of bureaucratic neglect. Walter adjusted his suit jacket as he climbed the steps, trying to project his usual judicial confidence despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the dated furniture and yellowing posters. The air smelled of old paper and cleaning supplies. A few people sat in plastic chairs, waiting their turn with blank expressions that spoke of hours spent in government office limbo. Walter approached the front desk where Mrs. Daniels, an older black woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, sat typing at an ancient computer. Her nameplate was well-polished, standing out against the dusty counter. "Good morning," Walter said, keeping his voice steady. "I need to review some old case files." Mrs. Daniels looked up, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed by something else. Suspicion, maybe, or concern. "You're Judge Grayson," she said, her voice low but clear. "The one trying to adopt those girls?" Walter nodded, fighting to maintain his professional demeanor. His heart rate picked up slightly. Mrs. Daniels studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to look right through his carefully constructed facade. She glanced around the office, then leaned forward slightly. "Celeste came here," she whispered. "The day before she disappeared. She was looking for something." Walter's pulse quickened. He leaned closer, trying to keep his voice casual. "What was she looking for?" Mrs. Daniels' eyes darted around again, checking to see if anyone was watching. Her hands moved beneath the counter, and when they emerged, she was holding a small key. "Storage room B," she murmured, sliding the key across the counter. "Bottom drawer, third cabinet." She pulled back, speaking in her normal volume. "You'll find the general archives through that door, Your Honor." Walter picked up the key, his fingers trembling slightly. He slipped it into his pocket, nodding his thanks. The hallway to the storage rooms was narrow and poorly lit. Walter's footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor as he made his way past rows of filing cabinets and shelves stuffed with boxes. The air grew mustier as he walked deeper into the building. Storage room B was marked with a faded label on a metal door. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and Walter slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. Dust motes danced in the beam of light from the single window. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their surfaces dulled with age and neglect. The room smelled of old paper and forgotten secrets. Walter moved carefully through the room, counting cabinets until he reached the third one. His hands shook slightly as he pulled open the bottom drawer. It squeaked in protest, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet room. There, among countless other folders, was a worn manila envelope labeled Avery Celeste in faded ink. Walter's heart pounded as he reached for it. Just then, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Walter froze, the folder halfway out of the drawer. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the jangle of keys. Someone was coming. Walter clutched Celeste's file to his chest as he darted out of storage room B. The sound of keys jingling grew louder, echoing through the narrow hallway. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he quickly ducked into an alcove between two tall filing cabinets. A maintenance worker shuffled past pushing a cleaning cart. The wheels squeaked against the linoleum floor as the worker moved down the corridor, oblivious to Walter's presence. Walter held his breath until the sounds faded away. Once the coast was clear, he made his way through the building, trying to maintain a casual pace despite the urge to run. Mrs. Daniels caught his eye as he passed her desk. She gave him the smallest of nods before returning to her work. The summer heat hit him like a wall as he stepped outside. Walter's dress shirt stuck to his back with sweat as he hurried to his car, constantly scanning his surroundings. The file felt like it was burning through his jacket. As he pulled out of the parking lot, a black sedan caught his attention. It was parked across the street, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Walter's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he turned onto the main road. The drive home became a nerve-wracking exercise in paranoia. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every car that stayed behind him for more than a few blocks made his stomach clench. He took 3 different routes, making sure no one was following him. When he finally pulled into his driveway, his shirt was soaked through with sweat. The house looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, but Walter couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He found Mira and Nia in the kitchen. They were doing homework at the table, textbooks spread out between them. Both girls looked up as he entered, their expressions immediately shifting from concentration to concern. Mira's sharp eyes took in his disheveled appearance, the way his hands trembled slightly as he set his briefcase down. "What happened?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Walter looked at their young faces, remembering how many times adults had lied to them, had hidden the truth to protect them. He wouldn't do that. They deserved better. "I found something," he said, loosening his tie. "Something dangerous." Nia's pencil stopped moving across her notebook. "About our mom?" Walter nodded. "Yes, about your mother." The girls exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations that twins seemed capable of having. Mira pushed her textbook aside. "Are you going to tell us?" "Not yet," Walter said gently. "I need to look through everything first, but I promise you'll know everything when the time is right." They didn't argue, but Walter could see the familiar wariness creeping back into their expressions. He hated putting that look back on their faces, but he needed to protect them from what he might find. Walter retreated to his office, locking the door behind him. The file sat on his desk like a ticking bomb. He poured himself a glass of water, trying to steady his nerves before opening it. The contents spilled across his desk, a damning collection of evidence that made his blood run cold. Bank statements showed regular transfers between Marcus Langley's personal accounts and various foster homes, including the Callahans. The amounts were substantial, far more than standard foster care payments. Case files documented Black children who had passed through these homes, many of whom seemed to vanish from the system entirely. No follow-up reports, no adoption records, nothing. Just empty spaces where lives should have been. Walter's hands shook as he uncovered a handwritten note. The paper was creased and worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. The handwriting was neat, but urgent. "They are taking our children, Walter, and no one is stopping them." His stomach lurched. Celeste had been trying to warn someone named Walter. Had she known him? Had she been trying to reach out to him specifically? The final document made his world tilt on its axis. It was a court order, authorizing the transfer of 3 young children to one of Langley's connected foster homes. The signature at the bottom was painfully familiar, his own. Walter stared at his signature, remembering that day. It had been a routine case, one of hundreds he'd presided over. He'd trusted the system, trusted the recommendations from the DA's office. He'd never questioned why these particular children needed to be moved so quickly, why standard procedures had been rushed. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had helped them. Without knowing it, without meaning to, he had been part of the machinery that kept this corrupt system running. His signature had condemned children to disappear into homes where money mattered more than their lives. The glass of water slipped from his hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. Water spread across the expensive boards, but Walter barely noticed. His mind was racing through years of cases, wondering how many other times he had unknowingly served Langley's purposes. How many children had suffered because he hadn't looked deeper, hadn't questioned the system he was part of. The sound of the breaking glass brought soft footsteps to his door. "Walter?" Nia's voice called through the wood. "Are you okay?" He looked at the scattered evidence on his desk, proof of his unwitting complicity in a system that had tried to swallow these girls whole. "I'm fine," he called back, his voice rough. "Just dropped something." The footsteps lingered for a moment before retreating. Walter began gathering the documents with trembling hands, his signature on that court order seeming to mock him from the desk. He had to make this right, not just for Mira and Nia, not just for Celeste, but for every child who had disappeared into the cracks of a system he had helped maintain. The question was, how do you fix something when you've been part of breaking it? The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Walter's study, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. He had barely slept, spending most of the night poring over Celeste's documents. His eyes burned from exhaustion as he made his way downstairs for coffee. That's when he saw it, a white envelope lying innocently on the floor near the front door, pushed through the small gap underneath. Walter's heart skipped a beat as he bent down to pick it up. Before he could reach it, Mira appeared from the kitchen. She was always the early riser of the twins. Without hesitation, she scooped up the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Her face darkened as she read the words. Nia emerged from the kitchen just then, drawn by her sister's silence. "What is it?" Walter asked, though part of him already knew. Mira held up the note, her hand steady despite the threat it contained. "Leave it alone. Or next time, it won't just be your house that burns." The words hung in the air between them. Walter reached for the note, wanting to shield them from this new danger, but Nia's voice stopped him. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't try to protect us, not from this." Walter looked at their faces, these girls who had endured so much already. He expected to see fear in their eyes. Instead, he saw something else entirely. Determination. Anger. Mira folded the note carefully, her movements deliberate. "We have to stop them," she said, her voice carrying a strength that made her sound older than her 12 years. "It's dangerous," Walter warned, though he knew it was futile. These girls had faced danger their whole lives. They'd been locked in basements, starved, and abandoned. They'd lost their mother to these people. A threatening note wasn't going to scare them away from the truth. "Everything's dangerous," Nia replied, "but doing nothing is worse." Walter looked at them, really looked at them. They stood straight-backed and resolute, their faces set with determination. They reminded him so much of Celeste in that moment, of the strength she must have had to stand up against this system alone. But they weren't alone. Not anymore. "Okay," Walter said, making his decision. "But we do this smart. We do this right." He knew exactly who to talk to. David Holloway was one of the last independent journalists in town, known for his fearless reporting and unwavering integrity. More importantly, he had a history of exposing corruption, even when it cost him personally. Walter arranged to meet David at a small cafe downtown, far from their usual haunts. He left Mira and Nia with strict instructions to stay inside and lock all the doors. They weren't happy about it, but they understood the necessity. The cafe was quiet at mid-morning, just a handful of customers scattered among the tables. David sat in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee. He looked exactly as Walter remembered: rumpled suit, perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, and eyes that missed nothing. "This better be good, Walter," David said as Walter slid into the booth. "You're not exactly known for dramatic secret meetings." Walter placed Celeste's file on the table between them. "It's better than good. It's the story of your career." David raised an eyebrow but opened the file. His skepticism lasted exactly 3 pages. Walter watched as the journalist's expression shifted from professional interest to shock, then to something approaching fear. David's hands trembled slightly as he read Celeste's notes. "If this is real..." He paused, swallowing hard. "This is bigger than anything I've ever touched." "It's real," Walter confirmed. "And there's more. The woman who collected this evidence, she disappeared. Her daughters are the ones I'm trying to adopt." David looked up sharply. "The twins? The ones everyone's talking about?" Before Walter could respond, the bell above the cafe door chimed. 2 police officers walked in, their faces grim and purposeful. Walter's stomach dropped as they made a beeline for their table. "Judge Grayson?" the taller officer asked, though it wasn't really a question. Walter stood slowly, very aware of the file still spread across the table. "Yes?" "You're under arrest for tampering with government documents and theft of confidential files." The cafe went silent. David started to protest, but Walter caught his eye and gave a slight shake of his head. The journalist understood. He gathered the documents quickly, sliding them into his briefcase while the officers were focused on Walter. Cold metal handcuffs clicked around Walter's wrists. As they led him toward the door, he caught a glimpse of movement across the street. His heart sank as he saw Mira and Nia standing there, having obviously followed him despite his instructions. Nia's face was a mask of fury as she gripped her sister's hand. Mira stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, but Walter could see the fire in her eyes. They watched as the officers pushed him into the back of a police car. Through the window, Walter saw Nia turn to Mira, her voice inaudible but her expression fierce. "We're not letting them win." The police car pulled away from the curb, leaving the twins standing on the sidewalk, their small figures growing smaller in the rearview mirror. But Walter had seen enough to know they weren't beaten, they weren't scared, they were ready to fight. The holding cell was a stark contrast to Walter's usual surroundings. Cold concrete walls pressed in around him, and the metal bench beneath him seemed to leach away what little warmth remained in his body. A single bulb cast harsh shadows across the cramped space, its light flickering occasionally as if to remind him of his powerlessness. Walter sat perfectly still, his judicial robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that felt foreign against his skin. His mind raced through the events of the morning: the cafe, David's face as he read the documents, and worst of all, Mira and Nia watching as he was led away in handcuffs. The sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor pulled him from his thoughts. Keys jingled, metal scraped against metal, and the heavy door swung open with a groan. District Attorney Marcus Langley stood in the doorway, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. My, Langley said, stepping into the cell. "How the mighty have fallen." Walter didn't respond. He watched as Langley pulled up the only other chair in the cell, its legs scraping against the concrete floor. The door closed behind him with a heavy clang, leaving them alone. Langley settled into the chair with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to power. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his tie precisely knotted. Everything about him spoke of control and authority. But his eyes were cold and predatory. "You know," Langley said, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve, "I always thought you were smarter than this, Walter. You had such a promising career. Respect, influence." He clicked his tongue. "And you threw it all away for what? 2 little girls?" Walter met Langley's gaze steadily. "You had Celeste killed." The words hung in the air between them. Langley's smile didn't waver, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "That's quite an accusation," he said softly. Then he tilted his head, like a curious bird examining its prey. "Prove it." Walter's hands clenched in his lap, but he kept his face neutral. Years on the bench had taught him the value of maintaining composure. Langley leaned forward, his smile turning cruel. "And while you're in here, what do you think happens to those little girls of yours?" The threat was clear. Walter felt ice spread through his veins, but he refused to let his fear show. He thought of Mira and Nia, of their strength and determination. They weren't helpless victims anymore. "They're stronger than you think," Walter said quietly. Langley laughed, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. "Strong? They're children, Walter. Orphaned, unwanted children. Who's going to believe them?" He stood up, straightening his jacket. No one believed their mother. Before Walter could respond, Langley knocked on the door. A guard opened it immediately. "Think about what's best for everyone," Langley said as he stepped out. "Some stories are better left untold." The door slammed shut, leaving Walter alone with his fears and the flickering light. Meanwhile, across town, Mira and Nia stood in front of David Holloway's office building. The newspaper's headquarters was an old brick structure, its windows grimy with city dust. They had memorized the address from Walter's contact list, sneaking a look while he was making breakfast that morning. "Are you sure about this?" Nia asked, squeezing her sister's hand. Mira nodded. "We have to finish what Mom started." They made their way through the lobby and up to the third floor. David's office was at the end of a long hallway, his name printed in fading letters on the frosted glass door. They could see his silhouette through the glass hunched over his desk. Mira knocked firmly. There was a pause, then footsteps. David opened the door, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise when he saw them. "How did you—" "We need your help," Mira cut him off, her voice steady despite her racing heart. David glanced down the hallway, then ushered them inside. His office was cluttered with papers and old coffee cups, the walls covered in newspaper clippings and awards. Celeste's file lay open on his desk. "You shouldn't be here," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Our mother died trying to expose this," Nia said, her eyes fixed on the file. "And now they have Walter." "We have to finish what our mother started," Mira added, her chin lifted in determination. David looked at them. Really looked at them. He saw past their age, past their size, to the steel in their spines and the fire in their eyes. These weren't just scared kids. These were Celeste's daughters, carrying her fight forward. He reached for his phone, his decision made. "Get me every reporter you know," he said into the receiver. "This story is going public." The courtroom buzzed with tension as spectators filled every available seat, their whispers creating a low hum of anticipation. Walter Grayson sat at the defense table, his usually impeccable appearance showing signs of wear. His suit, wrinkled from spending the night in a jail cell, hung slightly loose on his frame. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his sleepless night, but his posture remained straight, dignified despite his circumstances. Angela Carter, his defense attorney, leaned close to him. Her dark braids were pulled back severely from her face, her expression fierce and determined. She had built her career fighting against systemic racism in the justice system, and this case represented everything she had been battling against. "They're going to throw everything they have at you," she whispered, her voice low but steady. "Be ready." Walter nodded slightly, his eyes fixed on District Attorney Marcus Langley across the room. Langley sat at the prosecution table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expensive suit crisp and pristine. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he arranged his papers with deliberate slowness. He exuded confidence, the assurance of a man who had controlled the system for so long, he believed himself untouchable. The bailiff called for order, and Judge Evelyn Brooks entered the courtroom. She was known for her strict adherence to protocol and her zero tolerance for corruption. As she settled into her seat, adjusting her robes, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a thunderous crack. All heads turned as Mira and Nia Avery strode in, their small frames radiating determination. But they weren't alone. Behind them, like an army of justice, came David Holloway, flanked by a group of determined-looking reporters. Their press badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Community members filed in behind them, dozens of faces, all wearing expressions of grim determination. Camera flashes exploded throughout the courtroom, creating a strobe-like effect. David Holloway, his weathered face set with purpose, stepped forward. In his hands, he clutched a thick manila folder, Celeste Avery's file. Without hesitation, he approached the bench and handed it to Judge Brooks. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Brooks began reading the documents aloud. Her voice, clear and steady, carried through the hushed room as she detailed the contents. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers between Langley and various foster homes, the numbers highlighting a pattern of corruption that stretched back years. She continued reading, her voice growing harder as she went through witness statements describing abuse and mysterious disappearances of children in the system. Each word seemed to add weight to the air in the courtroom, making it harder to breathe. Then came the hidden report, the one Celeste had filed before her death, the one that had cost her her life. Judge Brooks's voice faltered slightly as she read the details of what Celeste had uncovered. A systematic exploitation of Black children in the foster care system, all for profit and power. Looking up from the documents, Judge Brooks fixed Langley with a penetrating stare. "Mr. Langley, do you have a response to these allegations?" The change in Langley was visible. His confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a sickly pallor. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tugged at his collar. This wasn't part of his plan. He had expected to crush Walter easily, to maintain control through fear and influence. But now, faced with irrefutable evidence and dozens of witnesses, his carefully constructed world was crumbling. Before Langley could formulate a response, the courtroom doors opened once again. A tall man in a prison jumpsuit walked in, escorted by 2 officers. His face showed the wear of 12 years behind bars, but his eyes burned with determination and dignity. Mira's voice rang out clear and strong in the silent courtroom. "That's my father." She stood up, her small frame somehow filling the space with authority. "And you stole 12 years from him." Isaiah Avery stood tall, his presence commanding attention despite his prison attire. His eyes found his daughter's, and for a moment, raw emotion crossed his face. Love, pride, and a deep, aching sadness for the years they had lost. Langley shot to his feet, his composure completely shattered. "This is ridiculous. These accusations are baseless. I demand dash." "You demand nothing," Judge Brooks cut him off sharply. "The evidence speaks for itself." As if on cue, more people began entering the courtroom. FBI agents, state investigators, and more reporters. They carried boxes of additional evidence seized from various locations, including the Callahan's foster home. Photos of hidden rooms, documentation of missing children, financial records showing years of illegal activities. The truth was finally seeing the light of day. Langley's face contorted with rage and fear as he watched his carefully constructed empire crumble. He tried to speak, to threaten, to maintain control, but his words were drowned out by the sound of handcuffs clicking around his wrists as federal agents approached him. "Marcus Langley, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy," one agent announced, leading him away from the prosecution table. Throughout the courtroom, other arrests were being made. The Callahans were led in handcuffs, their designer clothes and superior expressions replaced by shock and fear. Corrupt judges who had helped maintain the system, police officers who had looked the other way, officials who had buried evidence. One by one, they were identified and detained. Walter sat at the defense table watching it all unfold in stunned silence. The system he had been part of, the corruption he had unknowingly enabled, was being exposed and dismantled before his eyes. And it had been Mira and Naya, 2 young girls who had suffered so much, who had brought it all to light. The autumn sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. 3 months had passed since the day Marcus Langley was led away in handcuffs, and the town had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The courthouse itself felt different. Gone was the oppressive atmosphere of fear and corruption that had lingered in its halls for decades. Instead, there was a sense of renewal, of justice, finally finding its true purpose. Walter Grayson stood in courtroom B, adjusting his tie with slightly trembling fingers. This time, he wasn't wearing his judge's robes. Today, he stood as something else entirely, a man hoping to become a father. Mira and Nia sat in the front row, both wearing new dresses that actually fit them. Their faces had filled out over the past months, the haunted look in their eyes replaced by something closer to hope. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at Walter with small smiles. The changes in town were everywhere. Marcus Langley now occupied a cell in the state penitentiary, awaiting trial for decades of corruption. The Callahan's mansion had been seized by the state, its dark secrets exposed to daylight. Their basement, where so many children had suffered, was being transformed into a community center for foster youth. All across town, families who had been silenced for years were finally speaking out. Parents who had lost their children to the corrupt system were being reunited. Foster homes were being investigated properly, with new oversight committees established to prevent future abuse. Judge Maria Rodriguez entered the courtroom, her presence commanding respect without intimidation. She had been specifically chosen for this case, known for her fairness and her dedication to children's welfare. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Walter stood straight, his heart pounding. This moment meant more to him than any ruling he had ever made from the bench. He watched as Mira and Nia made their way to stand beside him, their movements more confident than they had been months ago. Judge Rodriguez smiled warmly at the girls. "Good morning, Mira and Nia. How are you both feeling today?" "Good, Your Honor," Mira replied, her voice clear and steady. The fear that had once made her shrink into herself was gone. "Very good," Nia added, and there was even a hint of excitement in her tone. The judge nodded, then began reviewing the adoption petition. She read through the home study reports, the character references, and the updates on the girls' progress in school and therapy. Everything was in order. "Mr. Grayson," Judge Rodriguez addressed Walter, "you understand the responsibilities you're undertaking? This isn't just a legal commitment, but an emotional and lifelong one." "Yes, Your Honor," Walter replied, his voice thick with emotion. "These girls, they've taught me more about family in these past months than I learned in my entire life before them." The judge turned to Mira and Nia, her expression gentle but serious. "Girls, this is your moment to speak freely. Do you both accept Walter Grayson as your legal guardian?" Mira and Nia looked at each other, having one of their silent twin conversations. Then they turned to look at Walter. In that moment, something profound passed between them. The months of healing, of learning to trust, of building something new from the ashes of their past, it all led to this moment. "Yes," they said in unison, their voices strong and sure. Walter, who had spent decades maintaining strict control over his emotions, felt tears welling up in his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. These weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of transformation, of a heart that had finally learned to feel again. Judge Rodriguez picked up her gavel, her smile widening. "Then by the power vested in me by the state, I hereby grant this adoption petition. Mira and Nia Avery Grayson, you are now legally the daughters of Walter Grayson. Congratulations to your new family." The gavel came down with a solid crack, and for once the sound didn't represent judgment or punishment. It represented a new beginning. Years passed, and the courthouse remained a constant in their lives, though its meaning had changed dramatically. On a bright spring morning, Mira and Nia Avery Grayson walked through its doors again. They were no longer scared children seeking refuge. They were confident young women, both wearing crisp suits and carrying briefcases. Their first case as attorneys was about to begin. In their hands, they held the file of a young black boy accused of a crime he didn't commit, a story too familiar to their own family's history. Their father, Isaiah, had lost 12 years to a similar false accusation. Now his daughters were determined to prevent another family from suffering the same fate. Walter sat in the front row of the gallery, his hair now more gray than black, watching with undisguised pride. He had retired from the bench 2 years earlier, choosing to spend his time mentoring young lawyers and advocating for foster care reform. But today, he wasn't here as a former judge or even as a legal mentor. He was here simply as a father, watching his daughters take up the torch of justice he had once carried. As Mira and Nia prepared their opening statements, they both glanced back at Walter. He gave them an encouraging nod, his eyes shining with the same tears that had fallen on their adoption day. But this time, they were purely tears of pride and joy. He was exactly where he needed to be, not on the bench making judgments, but in the gallery supporting his daughters. He had finally found his true purpose, not in maintaining the system, but in raising two extraordinary women who would help transform it. If you enjoyed the story of Mira and Nia, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this. If you enjoyed the story of Mira and Nia, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.